Hello world and welcome to HaXeZ. In today's video I'm going to be continuing the Hack to Learn series and I'm going to be talking about vulnerability scanning. So what is vulnerability scanning? Well, we've gone through various stages so far, including our environment setup. Again, that's important to make sure you have all the tools installed, and then we've talked about hacking legally. But after you've got your environment set up and you're on a project, you perform your open source intelligence gathering, whereby you don't directly interact with the targets that you're attacking. This is an information gathering phase to find out as much about the target as possible. Once you've done that and you're ready to begin scanning the phase and actively interacting with it, this is where you will perform active scanning or vulnerability scanning, and it's essentially just that. It's where you scan the targets for vulnerabilities that you may be able to exploit. It could be considered like a vulnerability scan, or something more invasive could be an actual full-blown penetration test, or you could just be hacking into a target. The point is when you scan the target directly and you're directly interacting with it, that is going to be your active scanning or your vulnerability scanning. There are a number of different types of tools that you can use to scan targets. It depends on what type of engagement you're on. For instance, if you're doing an infrastructure assessment where you're scanning a range of IP addresses, then the tools you use for that are likely going to be different from tools that you would use for things like web application vulnerability scans or mobile device configuration reviews or configuration reviews of other things. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to break down a few tools. I'm not going to cover everything, but I'm just going to cover a few basics of what you're going to encounter, early on in the industry, or if you're learning. I'm going to provide you with an idea of what sort of tools you should brush up on before going into that interview or before going into that technical test. So the first tool I'm going to talk about is Nmap. Now I have a video specifically for Nmap which goes into a lot more detail, and if you want more details on how everything works with Nmap, then I suggest going and watching that one as well. But Nmap is a crucial tool for network scanning, for identifying vulnerabilities, even exploiting vulnerabilities. Nmap is insanely powerful and way more powerful than I knew early on in my career. I was so naive and I thought it was just for identifying whether hosts are online or mapping out networks and finding out what services are online, but there is so much more you can do with Nmap. Now, on my screen what you can see is I've run a quite reckless scan, if I'm being honest. I wouldn't recommend running this self, especially against production environments. If you're just throwing it up against Metasploitable 2 in your own lab, then by all means go for it. But I will break down the commands and I'll show you what they're doing, and essentially this is a pretty good example, if not a very bad example of practice, of what Nmap can find. So I've done an Nmap and I specified my source port as 53, and the reason why I specified the source port as 53 with the -G flag is because it can help with firewall evasion. What you may find in a lot of networks is that the administrator has configured the firewall to allow traffic in from any source on port 53. So this could help with a bit of firewall evasion. If it's configured to block all traffic but suddenly, for some reason, allows DNS in, then because your packets are coming from 53, it sees it's DNS traffic almost, and it will send it through the firewall. Then I've got -F, which again is another firewall evasion technique. This is fragmenting packets, and what this does is it sort of splits it into multiples of 8. If you do -F, it'll split it into 8. If you do -FF, it'll split it into 16. And this again is another tactic used for firewall evasion. It wasn't essential for this scan, but I just wanted to include it just to show again the power of Nmap. Then I've got the SV flag, which is to identify service versions. That's how I remember it, SV, service versions. And what it will do is it will go through and perform a banner grab on the different services that it identifies, and it will try to find out what versions of those services are running based on the banner. A bit like if you were to telnet or to netcat to a service and query it, you'd usually get the banner at the top that says HTTP or Apache 2.4 or something like that. That's what SV does. Then I have -po, which you can just do with -p, but it just specifies all ports. Then I've got -O, which is to try and force operating system detection. And then I've got this wonderful flag called --script, and this again is probably where the danger comes in. So Nmap has an incredibly powerful scripting engine with an insane amount of scripts. If I just come down, I'm not going to grep it just yet, but if I just, if you grep for NSE or *NSE, you'll find all the Nmap scripts, and there's so many of them, and they can be broken down into various different categories. And what I've done is I've specified the categories, so it will run all scripts in those categories. So as you can see there, I specified vuln, auth, brute, and exploit. Now you can specify scripts individually, which is going to be the much preferred method of doing it, because you don't want to run an entire category of scripts against a client server and then knock the damn thing over because you've done too much to it. So what I've done here, definitely not recommended, but it's a good example to show you just how powerful Nmap is. And then I specified the IP address of the target, which is my metasploitable box in my test environment, and then I've got T5, which just says get a move on and do it quickly. So you can see I've got a bunch of errors at the start here, but what you can see is that it starts brute forcing the box. So again, it has built-in brute force functionality. It's not really a vulnerability scan, but if it finds weak credentials, I would say that's a system weakness. But anyway, I didn't want to focus too much on that, so I got rid of the brute flag, which I specified there, the brute script. So I got rid of that, but it was just nice to include it just to show what it can do. And that will go through all the different services, you know, probably starting at lowest and working its way up. You can see there it's done SSH brute. But yeah, I've removed that off there and I just ran it without the brute script. Now if we go through, you can see it's finding all these open ports, and now it's running all these NSE scripts. And you can see there it's looking for like SSL CSS injection, but you can also see it's now finding vulnerabilities. So you've got VSFTPD 2.3.4 and it has a backdoor in it. I believe this is the backdoor where if you specify a smiley face as the username, it will just log you in regardless. Feel free to Google that one. But yeah, as you go through, you can see that not only does it find out what versions of the services are running, but it will also identify any vulnerabilities on those services. So you've got CVEs coming out of everywhere over here, and you can see that there's exploits available for them, which again just goes to show that Nessus isn't just a network scanner. It's an insanely powerful tool that you can use to identify vulnerabilities. If you're in a tight pinch and you can't get other software set up, definitely Nmap would be my way to go. Did I say Nmap a minute ago? But yeah, Nmap is one of my favorite tools. It's always there, always reliable, and will help you identify a bunch of vulnerabilities, which then you can go and find other scripts for or other tools for to verify it. But yeah, I would say Nmap is probably at the top of the list for vulnerability scanners. You know, it's easy to get it installed. Take it with you everywhere you go. You can even run some scripts against certain web apps and things like that. So yeah, definitely don't overlook Nmap. Okay, on to probably a tool that you will find yourself using quite a lot if you are in the cyber industry. Whether you're red team or blue team, chances are you've heard of Nessus and you've used it. It's an insanely powerful, multifunctional security auditing, vulnerability scanning software. Nessus is amazing. The sheer amount of functionality you get in it is great. There are different level of versions, like there's an essential version which allows you to scan machines in your home network, and then there's a professional version which you will probably use in the industry, which allows you to scan, you know, various networks. And that has a lot more functionality. That can allow you to do things like audit cloud infrastructures, upload switch configurations to check for best practices. There's so much to it. And yeah, it is tiered in different versions, but I've only got the essential version installed here, but there's still a lot we can look at. So I'm just going to log in. And yeah, Nessus is made by Tenable. You can download the package onto your machine and install it, and yeah, it's insanely powerful. But if we go to new scans quickly, you can see here all the different types of scans that you have. So you've got a standard host discovery. So you could just throw in a IP range, a CEDAR address, and it will go through and it will find out all the live hosts that are available within that range. Then you've got your basic network scan. This will like scan for vulnerabilities on the host. It isn't too intrusive. You've got an advanced scan, which allows you to scan hosts with more specific credentials. Same with the dynamic scan. You've got a scan that will scan for malware on Windows systems and Unix systems. I believe you would need to submit credentials for this, but it will go in, it will look through the entire file system and look for anything that could be malicious. Mobile device scans, web application tests, where you would like provide the credentials and the URL for the web application, and it will go through and try and find vulnerabilities. A credential patch audit, so again, like things like on a Windows system, you would provide the credentials and it will go through and it will compare like the Windows updates with what's known to be the latest available updates, just to ensure that you've got the updates installed. Remote and local checks for a Intel AMT security bypass CVs there. You got Spectre and Meltdown. WannaCry or check for MS17010, I believe that's Eternal Blue, which is a vulnerability in SMB which allows you to perform remote code execution. There's a good box on HackTheBox about that, to be honest, and you can exploit it with Metasploit, dead easy. But yeah, it was using that the ransomware was allowed to spread. I believe it was actually programmed into the malware, into the ransomware, to like look for other SMB shares and send itself off to those and spread to other networks. But yeah, you can see there's an incredible amount of different scans you can do. Print Nightmare, again, I think that's a RCE in the print spooler, right? Log4Shell, another big one which recently happened, which allows you to get like shells because of the Apache logging software that was written in Java, and the way it sort of deserialized code in the logs. Basically, if you could write a bit of code that would get logged to the server would read it into the logs and execute it. Quite a scary vulnerability. I have found that in the wild before, which was terrifying. And you've got auditing of cloud infrastructures. So this is like Azure, AWS, Google Cloud. You can go in and you can just make sure that the cloud configuration is up to scratch, that it's meeting things like CIS benchmarks and things like that. Internal PCI network scan, again to make sure your standards are up to scratch with the payment card industries. PCI is anything that takes credit cards and things like that. So yeah, if you are accepting credit cards, you need to make sure that your infrastructure complies with the PCI sort of compliance, and that's there. Mobile device configuration reviews, so again, that's like your mobile device management software to make sure that's configured correctly and that, you know, people can't sort of bypass the MDM, that it's not configured in a stupid way that's just going to wipe all of the drives overnight or all of the phones. Offline configuration audit, these are great as well. If you've got like switch and firewall router configurations that you need reviewing, you can throw them into Nessus. Nessus will look through them, compare them to a benchmark of the best compliances out there, and it will point out, okay, you've got this, and this enabled in your firewall configuration, and it really shouldn't be, so review that and reconfigure it and report that to the client. But yeah, there's quite a lot going on, and what I've done is I've configured like an advanced scan and ran that. So if we go into my scans, and you can see there I ran this one today at 8:49 PM, and it's just against my Metasploitable 2 virtual machine, and as you can see, it breaks it down nicely. It tells you about like the CVSS scores, how long, like the time it took to run it. But if we click on vulnerabilities, you can see like all of the vulnerabilities that it found. So I mean, I love this type of software. You can just go in and see, okay, what's going on here then. So you look at this NFS exposed share information disclosure. So we've got our Etsy exports configured to like pretty much mount entirety of root, and it was able to mount it without a password or a username, I believe, and then see the contents of it. Quite a significant vulnerability, because you could just pop a key into .ssh for the root, and there you go, you're on the box as root. But yeah, this is a great vulnerability scanner. It's really flexible in everything that it offers, and it's really easy to configure as well. You'd have to get a bit of practice with it, but there's loads of guides out there on how to best configure Nessus for a vulnerability scan. But you can see there's found a backdoor shell. Again, this is Metasploitable 2, so it is all intentionally vulnerable. But yeah, there's a lot that can be looked into. But if we just go up and go into the configuration of the scan that I run, you can see there, I haven't given it a description, but I've given it a name, I've set the IP. You can set a schedule to tell it when you want to scan. You can send email notifications to yourself, and there you go, you can set discovery. So you can set ping to on, but if you're scanning a Windows box, it's likely not going to respond to ICMP, so you want to turn ping off. Make sure it's doing like a SYN scan instead. And then you can specify ports. I've specified all ports 0 to 65,535, and you can see there it's doing a SYN scan, so it's communicating rather than doing a full TCP three-way handshake. Then it's checking for SSL, so this is good if you want to check things like SSL certificates to make sure that the TLS configuration on the host is set to use strong protocols, and that all sort of ciphers that sort of depreciated are no longer available. Assessment, and here you can set like the thoroughness of the scan. You can tell it to like show potential false alarms and things like that. You can specify whether you want to brute force it and throw in word lists and things like that. Web applications, you can tell it to scan web apps, and you can set things like the user agent and things like that. So if you want to sort of show your client that it's you scanning it, you could put your own sort of name in the user agent, so all traffic coming from you is easily identifiable for the blue team. Yeah, you can query information about the Windows domain. You can scan for malware, you can scan databases, and then you get to the report section, and you can override that. You can say whether you've got limited disk space or not, and then you can say report as much as possible. And then you've got sort of how to configure the display of the final report. How do you want to show the hosts? And in the advanced section, you can enable safe checks. You can scan like IPs in a random order. You can stop the scans against particular IP addresses if they stop responding. So if you accidentally knock over a box, you can tell it to stop scanning. But you can also like slow down the scans when it detects network congestion, which is particularly useful if you're going into an environment where the network is particularly flaky. And again, this does happen. Here you can specify credentials as well for Windows SSH, and this will like allow you to do like a proper credentialed audit of the host, because what you may find just listening on the services may only be a partial of the story. There may be a lot more on the host itself that's vulnerable, things that could allow you to perform privilege escalation, and you'll want to find those things like unquoted service paths and read, write and execute permissions on files that you shouldn't actually have access to, which you could then overwrite and use to elevate your privileges once you restart the service, right? And then you've got a bunch of plugins as well, and one thing I recommend doing is disabling that one right there. I actually learned that off a colleague recently, and I was mortified to find out that I hadn't been disabling it. Probably shouldn't say that on a video, but yeah, definitely check your plugins before you run your scan, because there could be some on there that are quite dangerous. But yeah, that's Nessus. There's a lot more to it than I'll cover here, but again, this is an essential tool for penetration testing. There are alternatives out there as well, really good alternatives like OpenVAS, but this is probably something you're more likely to come across early on in your career in the industry, and it's definitely something that you should have a knowledge of if you're going in for an interview or a technical test. They're likely to ask you about tools like OpenVAS and Nessus and how to configure them. But yeah, that's Nessus, great tool, I'd be lost without it. So the next tool I want to talk about is Nikto. Nikto is a free web application security scanner. It comes pre-installed on most penetration testing distributions. Should be available in Kali and Parrot OS as a sort of base install. You should just get it on there, and what it will do is it will scan a specified target and look for weaknesses. It will look for out-of-date software. It will check the response headers coming back from the server to make sure there's no funkiness going on. It will look at the robots.txt file to see if there's any sort of secret information in there, because a lot of the time what developers will do is they will say they will tell the robots.txt file to tell the search engine indexing bots not to index the login URL for the administrator, so that could potentially have juicy information. Yeah, as you can see there, it's also finding out-of-date software with regards to Apache. It's finding what HTTP methods are allowed, and again, this could be quite dangerous if you've got HTTP methods for things like put and delete on there. Put can allow you to upload things to the server, and delete can allow you to remove things from the server. I think trace can be considered quite a dangerous one as well, because it traces the path back from the application. So if you've sent a request to an application and it has to go through like a load balancer and things like that, when the information comes back, it can potentially reveal the path it took to get to the application. I'm not too sure on that. Again, it's something I'm still sort of working out myself. Web application isn't my strongest point, but yeah, you can see their track method is suggesting the host is vulnerable to XST, and you can see it's found PHP my admin. Now again, I've just ran this against Metasploitable 2, and on there's an application in one of the subdirectories. If you just head to the IP address in your browser, you'll see links for things like damn vulnerable web app. I was hoping Juice Shop would be installed on it, but it isn't. But yeah, we've checked this one, and you can see there it's done a directory. It's found a directory traversal for etcpass WD, but it will go through and it will find potential vulnerabilities in the web application itself. Now, I wouldn't say Nikto is the be-all and end-all of web application security. You should still go through and verify everything that is found manually, and in a lot of cases it won't find everything that the application is potentially vulnerable to. Again, it's an automated script. You still need a human to go through and test things like input boxes for like business logic vulnerabilities and XSS, and if you see like an XSS payload is being encoded in the responses, and then you can like view the source code of that to see which sort of tags are encapsulating it. You know, there's only so much an automated scanner can do. There's still a massive human element that's needed for performing web application security tests. It's not like firing a Nessus scan at a service and seeing that, oh, it's out of date, you can hack into it, you know, or it's using weak credentials. There's a lot more sort of logic and reasoning to web application security scans that an automated web application security scanner won't find. But Nikto is great. It's a great place to start, and it can give you an insight as to what testing the application is going to be like. If you run Nikto against it and you find lots of vulnerabilities through Nikto, chances are there's going to be even more when you start testing it manually. So it's a good sort of kicking off point. Now, with that said, you should be careful running Nikto, because I have encountered moments where I've run Nikto against a web application and it started to become a bit sluggish or unresponsive. Granted, the sort of hardware that their web application was hosted on definitely wasn't fit for purpose, and you know, we definitely shouldn't be scanning stuff that's gonna fall over if you give it a little nudge. You know, we have to take those things into consideration though, and if the application starts becoming unresponsive, then you have to stop your scans and approach it from a more gentle perspective, going a bit easier. But yeah, Nikto is a great place to start. I will say though as well, in addition to it being quite a heavy scan sometimes and affecting a web application, it can be prone to false positives, especially when web application firewalls are in place. Now, sometimes it's great, it detects there's a web application firewall in place and it will just do what it needs to and report back what it needs to. But in some cases, I've seen some really interesting behavior whereby every directory it tries to hit is reported back as a 200 okay, like a 200 response saying, yeah, it exists, and it's like sort of checking all these files like shell.php, reverse shell.php, malware.php, and it's like, yeah, they all exist on this server. But what it is actually the web application firewall messing about with Nikto. It's probably recognized, or it's probably got patterns built into the WAF that know Nikto, and it's like, right, you know, let's just annoy the hackers and send them chasing their tails for a bit. But yeah, it's a good tool. It's a good introductory tool, not introductory tool, but a good start. You know, you run Nikto at the URL, very much just like an automated script. It's not gonna sort of hack a website for you, but it's a good idea. It's a good sort of scan to get an idea of how the web application is configured. Okay, you probably all knew this one was coming, but the final one I want to talk about is a web application security scanner known as Burp Suite. Burp Suite, made by Portsfigure, is probably the industry standard for web application security testing. Granted, there are other great tools out there like OWASP ZAP, but yeah, Burp Suite is probably what you'll encounter the most, is probably what the majority of sort of web application security consultants test with, just because the functionality inside it is so intuitive, is so good, and it's just so expandable. Now, I've only got the community version installed on my machine, so unfortunately I can't show you things like ActiveScan. I do use the pro version daily for work, but at home in my own lab I've only got the community version installed, which unfortunately is very restricted in the things that it can do. You know, your brute force attacks with Intruder are limited, like on limited request times. You can only send a certain amount of requests in a short period of time, and you don't have things like automatic spidering, crawling, where you sort of go through the web application and build a sitemap. In the pro version, you've got a tool where you can just like crawl it or scan it or crawl and audit it, and it will go through and it will populate this whole sort of sitemap for you. It's called Discovery, yeah, so there's an engagement tool called Discovery, and as you can see, engagement tools are blocked out on this version. But yeah, you've also got things like analyzing the target, simulate manual testing. I won't tell you about that, but it's a good trick. But there's also things like active scanning, which if you find like a specific parameter or a specific functionality that isn't too sensitive and you can get away with being a bit reckless with it, you can active scan that part of the web application to try and find vulnerabilities. But yeah, Burp Suite, it's essentially a web application proxy, so it does come with its own browser installed, and it's a version of Chromium. And what you do is you load your target up into this website, and instead of it going sort of directly into the browser to the application, all the traffic is relayed through the application into Burp. And you can see here, here's all the HTTP history. You can see the requests and responses it makes. And I'll tell you what, if you just wanted to learn a bit more about web applications, how they're built, what the different functionalities of them are, web application proxies are actually a fantastic way to learn about the different things that build up a website. For instance, you've got things like headers, you've got your cookies, and you can actually see the sort of back end, the matrix code, if you will, of web applications. You can see what happens when you send a request to google.com. It will specify the host, it will tell you what your user agent is, it will say the actual path to the file, it will tell you if you've come from a different website via the referrer. And again, this one, you know, you can see here in the responses there that they don't have any security headers in place. They haven't got their XSS protection or their X-frame options or cache control or things like that. You can learn a lot just by looking at the requests and responses to and from the application. So yeah, it's good just for learning about web application technologies, but also when you get into the nitty-gritty of it, it is great for finding vulnerabilities. So if you get a request, what you can do is you can send it to like Intruder, and then you can specify different parameters. So if I wanted to brute force a cookie as a really bad example, but you see there, you can clear the parameters off that, you can add the parameters back on, and then you go into your payloads, and then you can, from a list or from something else, again paid only, pro version only, you can specify a bunch of different things. So if you're brute forcing a password, you could specify a password list, and yeah, it would treat this like a variable. So on every request per item in the word list, it would substitute whatever is in the sort of weird quotation marks with the value in the word list, and it will brute force it. And then you also have repeater, and what repeater is good for is if you're working on a particular vulnerability, say you're looking at an SQL injection, but you're still working out how it works. So if you're doing like a union based SQL injection and you're trying to get the syntax right and you're structuring the commands so that you're selecting null, and you're trying to work out how many columns there are or something, or you're trying to concatenate it into one query, then you can keep sending the request with the repeater until you get it right. So you just be sending the request, and in the response it will come back and it'll be like 500 error, and then you can work out, why is it 500 error, why is it doing this, why is it doing that. I've actually turned the box off, but you can see there what would happen is it would send a get request to that, and the response of the application will come back here. But it's just good for sort of on the fly editing. Sequencer, this is good for sort of like predicting tokens and things like that. It can sort of, I think it's for detecting like the entropy in unique tokens. So if you've got things like CSRF tokens and things like that, you can start a capture on it where you highlight the sort of CSRF token or the unique token or the session token, and it will do requests over and over and over and over and over again, checking the sequence to see if it can predict the next one, and then it will develop like an entropy chart and tell you sort of how complex it is and whether it could be predictable. Very good, you know, because you don't want tokens to be predictable, especially if they're like session tokens, or you know, if they generate user IDs randomly and send them to the database or something like that. You don't want that information to be predictable. But then you've got decoder as well, so if you capture cookies that are encoded in like base64 or MD5s, you can decode them in here, or if you find some information that's being submitted in an encoded way, then you can come in here and try and smart decode it. It's a bit like CyberChef, if you've ever used that. You can sort of smart decode different values and it will try and identify what has been encoded with and actually bring back the sort of raw text form of it. Comparer, this is good if you've got two requests. So if you're trying to do username enumeration, for instance, and you're sending requests to the server, what you can do is you can compare the response lengths. And if you notice that two responses from the server are different slightly by a few bytes in the response length, what you can do is you can bring them to Comparer and it will highlight exactly where the difference is in the program. Another great feature, again, which could help with username enumeration. Logger just logs things. Extender. Okay, so this is one of the really most powerful things about Burp as well. If you go into the BAP store, you can see there are a lot of plugins that you can add to improve the functionality of it. We've now got like Log4Shell scanner, Log4Shell everywhere, which will automatically append like specific Log4Shell payloads to your headers and things like that. So when you send a request, it will try to execute a Log4Shell payload, and then it will sort of work with a feature of Burp called Collaborator. You get a collaborator server, and it will do like a DNS request back to that collaborator server to see whether like the code execution was successful. But yeah, there's loads of things in here that can like improve functionality, improve logging, and make things like prettier. You've got like SQLi, which integrates with SQLmap. To go through them all would take for ages, but it just goes to show like the actual power of Burp Suite, all these different additions that you can add to it to make it better. And then you've got like your project options. I was just talking about the sort of collaboration server earlier. You can specify your own collaboration server, which again would be recommended for clients, because if you're sending sort of collaboration requests to Burp server, then again that's potentially that's client information that could be being potentially sent back there. But you can configure things like client certificates in here. So if you've got if you're testing a web application that needs client certificates, you can configure the client certificates in here. One other thing as well, which just crossed my mind, is if you're testing APIs, like web applications without the front end, you sort of interact directly with the API endpoints, you can launch like REST APIs in Postman and bring those and then proxy Postman into Burp, so everything's recorded in Burp anyway. Again, so powerful. And you can do things as well, like I think you can actually tell Hydra to go through Burp as well. So if you're doing brute forcing, you can actually specify a proxy in Hydra to go through there. But yeah, like with most things you can specify a proxy. But yeah, this is going to be like your primary tool for doing web application security scans. It isn't the only tool. Again, I mentioned OWASP ZAP, which is very similar. It's laid out differently, and quite frankly I struggle when I have to use OWASP ZAP because I just don't use it that much. But Burp Suite is an excellent tool, and if you haven't done already, go and check out Portswigger's Web Security Academy labs. They've got labs for every type of web application vulnerability, and they allow you to drill it over and over again, so you can sort of get familiar with the process, how to identify it, how to exploit it, and learn more about it. And it's definitely worth going through the labs, and they do offer a certification for it as well, which I believe is like 60 quid at the moment, so that's worth it. If you can get that, you've sort of proven your worth in the industry right there, because it's not an easy qualification to get. But yeah, that's Burp Suite. That is your probably most common web application security scanner. Well, that's it. Those are the tools I wanted to cover for this section. Again, I haven't covered a lot of tools. There are many more alternatives out there, but really what this aims to do is essentially allow you to find vulnerabilities. Once you find the vulnerabilities, the chances are you would have to jump into another tool or get another script from GitHub in order to exploit it. So say if you use Nmap or Nessus to find like a CVE, you can then jump into something like Metasploit to try and find an exploit for that CVE, or use Searchsploit to get a particular script that exploits that CVE. So yeah, it's not supposed to be like how to exploit the box or anything like that. I'm going to do a video on that after. I'm going to do like part 6 is probably going to be more about exploitation, but this is more supposed to be about finding vulnerabilities, what tools you can use to find vulnerabilities, and there's definitely a lot more out there, and this really only covers like infrastructure and web applications. You know, there's like mobile specific things, there's a lot more to it, but for someone like in cybersecurity as a penetration tester, this is probably what you'll sort of encounter first, is like infrastructure jobs and web application jobs, and then you'll get into like more configuration reviews and sort of mobile device assessments later on down the line. But I feel like these are some great tools to start off with, and yeah, they're my favorite tools as well. You know, they are a lot of fun to use, and I know it sounds quite nerdy to say, but especially things like Burp and Nessus, when you can actually get into the requests and the responses, or you can actually see how Nessus sort of attacks a particular service and the output that it gets. It's a lot of fun to actually look through that and see how things actually work and what's actually happening behind the scenes when you do these scans, you know. And just think of the people who actually came up with the tools that made these, who wrote the tools, who found the exploits. Absolute geniuses. But anyway, this has been vulnerability scanning, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give me a thumbs up. Perhaps you could subscribe, drop me a comment. I know it's a bit more rushed than my other videos, and I haven't really put that much care and attention into it, but I just wanted to get it out there. I just wanted to sort of get past like the vulnerability scanning phase and get into the more sort of serious exploitation. But yeah, anyway, kind regards.